This is CyberSound, your simplified and fundamentals-focused source for all things cybersecurity.
Welcome to CyberSound. I'm your host, Jason Pufahl, joined, as always now, by Michael Grande.
My regular seat.
Now it's becoming official, right? And there's only two of us, so we're not all cramped.
Yeah, exactly.
And we've got Senator Tony Hwang. Pleasure to have you again. I'm glad that we could find a time to do a redo.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and we tread new ground every time we get together, and it's always insightful, and I appreciate the opportunity to be able to share and try to be a resource to help our general public.
Yeah, of course. So I think we're going to insert a little audio clip here of a conversation between us just from a few days ago. So we'll let people listen to that for a second. Welcome back, folks, to another episode of CyberSound. Today, we have a special guest joining us, State Senator Tony Hwang, who has been vocal in the state legislature about risks associated with the spread of disinformation due to artificial intelligence. Welcome, Tony.
Thank you for having me on, Jason.
It's great to have you, Senator. So let's dive right in. What exactly concerns you about AI?
Well, Mike, AI has immense potential, no doubt. But my concern lies in its misuse. Take deepfakes, for instance. These AI-generated videos can manipulate reality to a dangerous extent. We're talking about impersonating people, spreading false information, and even potentially inciting violence.
That's a valid concern, Senator. Deepfakes are indeed a growing issue. But do you think there's a way to mitigate this risk without stifling innovation?
Absolutely, Mike. Education and regulation are key. We need to raise awareness about deepfakes and their implications while also implementing strict laws to hold perpetrators accountable. But we also need to invest in advanced detection technologies can help identify and combat the spread of malicious deepfakes.
It sounds like a multifaceted approach is necessary to address this challenge effectively. What are your thoughts?
Precisely, Jason. We have to embrace the benefits of AI while remaining vigilant against its potential harms. It's about striking a balance between innovation and security to ensure a safer future for all.
Well said, Senator. I feel like the more we spread awareness on this critical issue, the closer we will come as a society to coming to a consensus on where AI is beneficial and useful and where it can cause irreparable harms.
For those at home listening, none of this exchange was real. It was scripted using ChatGPT and generated using 11 Labs' AI voice cloning technology. Pretty concerning, right? Let's dive in. So, pretty interesting, right? I mean, really convincing.
Extraordinary, really, is the word I would describe.
Senator, do you want to speak? It was your office that helped put this together, right? So do you want to talk to how that happened?
I am frightened because this was done without any input or my voice. Right. As you hear it now, and that's the real dramatic impact that someone could take my audio from a compilation of what we do as part of our legislative work and public communications work to be able now to create an entire message and now a dialogue with podcast programs with sort of the validation with my voice and obviously my potential kind of acquiescence per se in misrepresenting maybe my viewpoints. Although what was said there was right in line with what we talked about, right. But nevertheless, the potential for ill intent and malfeasance is just unimaginable. And as I said before, when we did the podcast before, was that this is a tremendous invasion in privacy, in identity theft, but most important of all, the real impact on how we have to manage in technology. So it really fits right in with what your podcast is all about, is how do we understand what's happening in the profound impact of artificial intelligence that is all around us to really understand it so we can protect our businesses, families, and personal identities.
Yeah, and your reaction is real, which I think is the important part about this, right? Like, you and I have a good enough relationship that I felt comfortable saying, well, let's get this deepfake together. And you had no idea. So it wasn't until you heard it and you realized, holy mackerel! Like this seems convincing. Everything about this, the message is legit. You cannot distinguish the voices from your real voice at all, right? It's perfect in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Well, my wife can tell, but I got to tell you, what was really kind of the startling for me was the exchange.
Yeah.
The flow
cadence
of exchange that made it real and conversational rather than a one-way transaction. That is really the frightening part. I mean, we're doing this podcast. We could literally replace talent with a message and theme based upon AI generated kind of messaging. And that really gets to where we are is artificial intelligence is now this profound technological impact on our society, but we really don't fully understand it. And I'll be honest with you. You talk to the general public, they're like, AI, is this Terminator where we're going to create machines that are going to take over the world? Or is this going to create efficiencies and help those within our society to advance in technology? Or is it something that could be profoundly an assistance to help in educate, in workforce development, and in innovation and productivity? We just don't know. But the reality is, I try to simplify it. It's supercomputers that takes in hundreds of millions and trillions of data point. And now we're creating computers with enough power generation and sophistication that we can create algorithms that takes that data. So, the algorithm of what we watch on YouTube and TikTok, and how one video flows from another and another and another, that's all algorithm based upon your viewing pattern,
your interests.
And you're kind of being put into a trance. How many times have we seen our friends, not just kids, but young adults, just sit there for minutes on end and start laughing and being cued by a machine, and they continue on as though you're oblivious to them, even though you're right next to them.
The formula seems to work each time, to sort of entrance you into that state. If we jumping off talking about AI, and thank you, that was really helpful. Sort of segue. Maybe we define sort of deep fake, because it's almost like another component of this whole conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think we assume people always know what this stuff is, and deep fake is not. It's not incredibly complicated in the sense that it's just taking the content and creating something from existing images, sounds, or videos, right, that appear to be legitimate, appear to be real, but are completely manufactured through technology. I mean, that's all we're doing, right? And I think people have heard about the Taylor Swift things, right? Because nobody misses any of the Taylor Swift things. But I think there's more mundane uses for this, or day-to-day uses that, to the senator's point, that we see all the time, which is content that's simply curated and directed at you because you've demonstrated an interest, and it continues to just simply feed your interests rather than give you diverging viewpoints, which is a huge risk.
Is there a tremendous amount of, we were talking about all the data points, and I think, as we talk about machine learning, artificial intelligence, and the vast amount of data that we create on a daily basis for ourselves and our businesses and all the other things that we do, is there, is this an onerous process to go through this and create it? Is it sort of like how much work does it take, I guess, to create this?
Well, it's frightening that it really doesn't, because look at the exchange that was created. It took 15, 20 minutes, and that is a high level of sophistication. I think the other part of it is you're right, Jason, talking about, we hear about deepfake, about Taylor Swift, but how many other transactions have occurred that are innocent? It is not a coincidence that AI has been very much prevalent in our everyday presence. Look, Google phones advertise as their strength that they have cameras that can put a different smiling face, and create a different kind of a facial reaction, gets rid of blinking eyes and smirky, closed mouths, that they can artificially manipulate the photo. That's a selling point.
Right.
That is all AI in altering photos, right?
In real time.
And the chat and the 111 that did the voice audio. These are all kind of the features that people use for everyday convenience to make their lives and their content more interesting and creative and more perfect kind of presentation. But taken to another degree in regards in wrongdoers' hands, it could be very dangerous, and it could create real bad intentions. And how do we get to that? So for us in the legislative body this year, we looked at, obviously, Senate bill, is it 2 or 3? I've forgotten. It's only been 2 weeks. But it's the AI bill. But it was such a comprehensive bill. But tucked in that section was 2 parts that I thought was very, very important. One was to give some criminal protection, a criminal punishment to protect against use of deepfake imagery, false representation, and revenge that's used against people using AI. Now, one of the questions is, who do you regulate? Who do you punish for these criminal behaviors? Do you catch the person who is perpetrating this? Well, they could be from 8 different protection zones and different countries and identity anonymously. Who do you protect once that content goes out, right? The problem is you can say, oops, this ill-begotten and vengeful content goes out. You say it's wrong, you get rid of it. But how many people have screenshot this? How many people have captured it and create irreparable damage, right? So who do you, when we looked at policy, who do you hold responsible for the regulation and the protection in this marketplace? One, you want to catch the perpetrators, no doubt. The other, I think, critical is for those technology companies that procure and sell and deliver these sources. They have a higher standard to ensure that these kind of content, as well as who is presenting that content, is regulated. And that's a really thin line on that. I know.
Yeah, and that sort of leads to a question, and I appreciate your sort of review of that bill that was out there. I don't believe it was passed on this session.
And that Senate bill too, just to make sure that people want to take a look.
But if you could, from your perspective, right, and perhaps this is just an opinion, but I'm interested to hear where you feel the majority of the responsibility does lie in sort of ferreting out sort of these false images or deep fakes that may exist, or the proliferation of some of the content that may get transmitted on social media. Is it with the media outlets who accidentally may continue to promote something? Is it with the social media companies? Is it with the individual and the consumer? You talked about sort of that long chain of custody, right? All the different hands it could touch. At what point, where does the responsibility ultimately lie from a legislative perspective in your eyes?
From my perspective, first and foremost, it is the perpetrator of these kind of attacks, whether it is ill intention or a humorous take.
Sure.
Ultimately, I think the perpetrators need to be first and foremost held accountable for delivering and perpetrating and promoting this talent. Now, you're going to say that technology companies has a role. I do believe they have a role. And upon finding that these kinds of ill content are out there, they have a responsibility then now to regulate and define where the originating documents came from, where the ISPs are, and then do the due diligence to close that action out.
Right. Quickly pull that content down.
Yeah.
Right. So I think there has to be a flow of accountability. And so when I say that, let me repeat again, the perpetrators are first and foremost those people that need to be held accountable.
Yeah.
Don't do it.
Right.
Number 2, then it is incumbent for an accountability and a responsiveness of the content providers and the deliverers to take a look and punish these perpetrators, to not allow these actions to continue. But number three, it is also the protection of the consumer of that product. We, as a consumer of that product, cannot be drawn by it and perpetrating and sharing that information. That we need to understand that this is ill-begotten. Raise, send a note and an alarm and a spam call to say this is wrong, and to also recognize that continuation of that misinformation could potentially open each individual to liability.
Right. So yeah, don't share it, don't promote it.
Exactly. That has to be a education message to say, oh, it came onto my feed, but I took a snapshot of it, a screenshot of it, and I'm continuing to promote it and push out content. Then you have a responsibility. I do believe it extends to that there has to be some degree of personal responsibility. But here's the problem, right? In some ways, people don't know if it's the wrong information.
So I think so that's such a great point, because I spend a lot of time doing security awareness training, and generally I'm able to say, well, look for these telltale signs or look for these markers, and that will help you identify it. In the cases of like the deepfake that we played earlier, it's really challenging to identify. It might not be quite as conversational as this, right? So maybe that's a little bit of a cue, but the reality is most people aren't listening that carefully. They're not that discerning. I think the responsibility is less on can I identify it, and more if it's been identified as illegitimate content, they have a responsibility not to share it. So at least at a minimum, you should not proliferate something that is deepfake, something that's created, something that isn't authentic, even if you haven't been able to identify it individually or personally.
I think back, of growing up and all of the literature classes that I would take, and the importance of citing your work and always knowing sort of the sources, right, that were used and giving credit appropriately. And obviously we can go on and on about how society has changed from that perspective. But yeah, we just don't have that expectation of really relying on, hey, this has been completely, investigated and it's coming from a truthful source, and we can rely on this information really easily.
The content can be so professionally produced that, and then think about that. Think about that, the algorithm in which all we get from our news is through this phone.
All through the phone.
We are, through the algorithm, siloing the same content. And the provider provides that kind of soundbite that we no longer use citations.
Right.
That I had a chance to talk to about 60 high school students, seniors, who are going to go out in the world, who has a voice. And I said, how many of you get your news from the phone? Every single one of them. How many read the paper? 1 out of 60 said they read the New York Times, right? But then the rest of it is, where do you get contrasting viewpoints? Well, we don't.
We don't.
You go into the silo, and we wonder why people have taken and society as a whole have taken on such a divisive, one way or the highway kind of tone manner. I mean, look, make no mistake about it. Our environment right now is, I'm right, you're wrong.
Right.
I thought that only existed in my household, but nevertheless, the conversation right now in many things is people don't even want to talk about it. Right. They don't want to have disagreeing, contrasting viewpoints, because who wants that? It's confrontational. It creates discomfort. I'm going to go back to my phone and watch the things that I like to watch.
Yeah, validate your perspective.
Reaffirms the things and gives me stability and comfort in the world as I know it.
Discourse.
I may rail against it, but in my own personal world, I'm convinced of my viewpoint.
Right. You're right.
And boy, and I'm right.
Right. So
that's the power of the AI, the algorithm, the generation, and it's much more subtle, not on a widespread, fraudulent, or dramatic impact, but it is kind of the social creep that has changed our society. It's remarkable. Now I'm old enough to know, and I said to the class, I'm old enough to know when a laptop didn't exist and a smartphone didn't exist. And the kids look at me like I'm a dinosaur. But think about that. We grew up in a generation
It's not that long ago
where we didn't have that phone. And think of how fast it has in a span of 30 years, how we have transformed. So when we talk about discourse and divisiveness and the real steadfast friction that we have, perhaps we should look at the subtle assimilation and transformation of our society, because we're getting fed the same information over and over again, and we're creatures of comfort.
So, all right, I think we are getting to a point where we're going to have to start thinking about wrapping up. But there's one really, really important topic that we need to cover, and it's germane to everything we just spoke about, which is we're entering election season. How concerned are you and your peers about the potential for deepfake or any of the technology that we just discussed here to have an impact on the election? Do you envision actual uses of this that could potentially turn the tide for certain candidates, or at least have a real negative impact on other candidates?
Absolutely, because as you get further and further away, and you have many elections in which it's not local, right? Even with local anymore, where outlets do you have? You don't. The only outlet is through the algorithm of these phones. And again, going back to the same theme we've had the whole the podcast, is the information you get is so narrowed down and siloed that if you believe in one viewpoint, you're going to get that fed repeatedly. One of the most wonderful experience I had with those high school students was they saw me as an individual, not as a label, not as an imagery. But think about that. If you have statewide elections, region-wide elections, how possible is for myself to have an exchange one-to-one for them to break labels and perceptions? Right. So when you think about where deep fakes and imagery is happening, it may not need to be so explosive, to be so kind of controversial. But what's more dangerous is the insidious reinforcing creep of information. I was just listening to a podcast that said in North Korea, an authoritarian, communist, authoritarian one-person rule government, they created a imagery campaign that said the ruler could levitate and walk on water. And would you believe it? For those people in that country, they believe it. And even
they don't
for
have
those
any alternate sources.
Right? They're the ultimate source. And just think of what's happening in Russia and other authoritarian countries. Look, I grew up in an authoritarian government that, even though it was a democracy, it was under martial law for 38 years. It wasn't odd to me that when the president died, his son took over.
Right.
It was a democracy. There was no third rail of independent thought and press. So with that said, even the people from North Korea, that was the scary part about the podcast. When they left the country and they lived in freedom, they still believed in the indoctrination and the brainwash. So the most powerful thing is that we need to understand where are we getting our information and how can we define it, process it, and get contrasting viewpoints. Elections have consequences, but nevertheless, the flow of information is decidedly partisan and one-sided, and we need to branch out on that.
And ultimately, right, the controlling of the media has been the way that many elections have been won and lost over the years. So this isn't substantively different. I think it's the scale and the speed at which it can be done is the difference today. So the risk and the threat are the same. The medium and the mechanism to actually accomplish it are different.
And we talked about the limited number of steps used. You take the candidates. There's plenty of information. There's plenty of data points. There's plenty of apps and programs available. Everybody essentially becomes a proliferator if they choose to be, and that's a scary proposition.
So
that is scary, and the speed in which that gets done is just it's just mind-boggling on that process. But nevertheless, I think it is a very much of a heads up warning for people to think and process deliberately
what they're seeing,
and not always take what is being told to them. If something sounds too good to be real, I say this all the time. An individual's campaign promoting themselves, they're never as good as they're promoting themselves, nor are they ever as bad as the opposition promotes it. It's common sense. You have an opportunity in this country. That's the great gift. You have an opportunity in this country to pick up the phone, send an email, and demand accountability for those that you elect. And a lot of people just relinquish that. And that is one of the greatest things that we need to be sensitive of: accountability, transparency, and ultimately self-determination and independent thinking.
And I think you demonstrated how important it is to be out in the public, viewable, and human. Instead of purely this, digital face that everybody gets to be sort of recognizing you as. So, it's important to still get in touch with people on a human level. Senator, it's great always having you. I enjoy the conversation. I think this one in particular is on the minds of a lot of people entering the election season. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, helping to govern this and helping to identify appropriate legislation in this space, especially in something in a new field like this. Hopefully, we can have you on again in the future. It's always fun.
No, it's a pleasure. And I'm reminded as we head into Memorial Day, and we think about the sacrifices made by our men and women in the armed forces to give us the rights that we have. Listen, we have one of the greatest countries in the world with liberties and rights that we have. We have press, we have the freedom of thought. And I'll be honest with you, growing up for the years that I have in an authoritarian rule, you didn't know any better.
Yeah.
And what you're doing and bringing information out and what we have in this country is one of the true greatest gifts that we have. And sometimes we take it for granted.
Right.
So I appreciate the opportunity. It's a privilege to represent.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
If anybody has comments, feel free to let us know. The best way to get this message out, and it's an important message, so people understand what the risks are. Like, subscribe. The more people that hear it, the more people understand what they're up against. So as always, Senator, thank you. And I'm sure we'll talk in the future.
Thanks, guys. Have a great week.
Thank you.
Bye.
We'd love to hear your feedback. Feel free to get in touch at Vancord on LinkedIn. And remember, stay vigilant, stay resilient. This has been CyberSound.